Refusing to forgive someone is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
Yeah, wow.
When I held on to my anger, my hatred, and resentment towards my ex, he wasn't being punished. He wasn't the one that continued to hurt. I was only hurting myself. I was drinking the poison by continuing to hold on to the grudge of his wrongdoing.
Welcome to the Blended Family Coaching Show, where you'll discover how to move your stepfamily from just surviving to truly thriving.
Grab your headphones and listen in as we share practical, real-life strategies for building healthy bonds,
Understanding the kids' perspective,
romance and partnership,
parenting with great teamwork.
and yes, even co-parenting with a difficult ex.
We're Mike and Kim Anderson, and we believe with the right tools, every step couple can overcome the common challenges of stepfamily life.
Join us for authentic and sometimes comical conversations to discover how you can lead your family with confidence and create the future you really want. Well, hello and welcome to the Blended Family Coaching Show.
Howdy, howdy, howdy.
We're so glad to be here with you today. And we just want to remind you, if you have a few extra minutes, if you don't mind going and giving us a rating or a review over on Apple Podcasts, that would be great.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we'd appreciate that.
And with that, we'll kick off the show.
That's my welcome.
Perfect. Today we want to tackle a topic, so we want to jump right in. And this topic can get complex and complicated, but it's something that we all need to work through if we really want to move beyond some of the painful realities of blended family life and really thrive. So what is this topic? Well, you've already read the title, so you probably know it's forgiveness.
Yeah.
And it's a tough topic. And that's part a heart issue. It's part a mindset. And the good news is it's also part practical skill, which means that we can take some intentional steps in this area of forgiveness, as opposed to just kind of waiting around till we feel it. You know, that's really good news because it means we can actually do something about it.
Yes, we can take action.
Now, we all need to accept that we'll have our feelings hurt and we're going to be wounded in some way at some point along the journey. This is just unavoidable in blended family dynamics. You should expect that you're going to experience pain due to the words or the actions of those people that are in close proximity to you. Now, that hurt might be at the hands of a stepchild who rejects your efforts to connect or is just plain old disrespectful or rude to you. You'll certainly be hurt by each other because these dynamics are really hard and you're going to make mistakes that's going to cause each other some emotional pain. Like Kim and I, we both know that, right? And even when it's unintentional, there can still be some residual hurts and resentments that can create some unresolved anger.
Yeah.
And of course, sometimes you'll likely hold on to some old hurts from the past, and you might really struggle to let go of anger that's directed toward an ex-spouse.
Yeah.
Especially if co-parenting lately has been less than cooperative. We'll just put it that way. Or maybe it's anger and resentment toward your spouse's ex or even the ex's new spouse. Like this gets complicated, right? There's a lot of people that can create pain, but sometimes it's just because they're responding in a negative way and it impacts our home.
Yeah.
Right?
Definitely.
The truth is there's going to be no shortage of hurt feelings, and there will probably be varying degrees of emotion that you're going to need to work through. Everything from minor irritation that makes it challenging just to be around that other person to some real intense animosity and bitterness that's taken root, making it very difficult to interact or communicate.
Yeah.
So since we know that all of us are going to experience hurts in this awkward, tricky, confusing, complicated blended family journey, the big question is this: what are you doing with your hurts? Are you holding on to the offense and allowing anger, bitterness, and resentment to negatively impact you? Or will you choose to find ways of working through it? And will you seek to come to a place of forgiveness so that you can move on in a healthy way? This is the question we're challenging you to ask yourself, to be gut level honest with where you're at. Now, if you're starting to ask yourself that question, you might be thinking, but you know what? They don't deserve to be forgiven after what they've done to me. Or I'll forgive them when I get an apology for what they did and they pay for what they did. If that's where you're at right now, we get it. We've both been there in that place with each other. We've been in that place with Kim's ex, and certainly in step relationships as well. And we want to encourage you to stick with the conversation in this episode, because if you're carrying a burden of hurt, anger, and pain, we'd like to help you just take a next step toward releasing that burden and then moving forward in a way that's healthy for you and for your family as well. You don't have to stay stuck. And we're going to do our best to just give you some positive mindsets, some habits, and some actions that will help to set you free from these past injuries and even sometimes from the ongoing offenses.
Yes, and you deserve that.
That's right.
All right, so let's start out by keeping things real. We know that forgiving someone can be extremely hard to do. This takes work, and sometimes we feel a deep need to hold on to unforgiveness. We believe that if we were to forgive that person, it'll let them off the hook for their bad behavior. But the truth is that when we refuse to move on and we hold on to our hurts, we will continue to hurt. When we continue to relive the offense over and over and we become attached to our anger, the other person continues to have a negative impact on our life. They keep hurting us. And this actually intensifies and prolongs our suffering. I love a particular quote because it's helped me to forgive my ex-husband for all the pain that he caused me and my daughter through our horrible season of parental alienation. When I continued to hold on to the pain, even years after the court proceedings were resolved, this quote from Nelson Mandela gave me the motivation to find ways of letting go of those past offenses and actually reclaim my life. And here's that quote. Refusing to forgive someone is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
Yeah, wow.
When I held on to my anger, my hatred, and resentment towards my ex, he wasn't being punished. He wasn't the one that continued to hurt. He didn't even care. I was only hurting myself. I was drinking the poison by continuing to hold on to the grudge of his wrongdoing. And the heaviest thing you can carry is a grudge.
Oh, that's good.
It will invade your thoughts, dictate your mood, and control how you show up for your family. And I only know this because we lived it. And it was so ugly. I allowed my ex's behavior to control my own behaviors and emotions. I got really depressed and upset when I think about what he did, which was often. Yeah. I'd get angry and lash out at people around me that had nothing to do with what happened. I allowed his words and actions to steal my joy and rob me of the happiness that I deserved, all because I believed that he didn't deserve my forgiveness.
Yeah.
And this was such a vicious cycle, and it actually held me captive in a state of emotional turmoil. It was horrible, but thankfully, I was able to work with my counselor to engage in the process of forgiving my ex. But I have to tell you, this was a choice. I had to decide that I would move on. And this was not an easy process.
No, I watched you go through it.
Yeah, it was tough, but it was well worth it because once I was able to release that burden of hurt and let go of the grudge, I experienced a powerful sense of freedom that's hard for me to even describe. He didn't get to hurt me anymore.
Yeah.
It was amazing. The choice to forgive him was a choice that set me free. It was no longer about letting him off the hook or not. It was about reclaiming my own peace of mind. Listen to this quote that I also love. Forgive others, not because they deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve peace.
Oh, that's really
I love
good.
that.
Yeah. You know, so clearly forgiveness was an important part of your journey, hon.
Yes.
And we've seen that to be true with a lot of other couples that we've worked with over the years too. And that's why we're talking about this today. So we want to dive in and talk about what are some things we can do. How do we practically choose to begin the process of forgiveness?
Yeah.
And to start that conversation, let's consider anger.
Oh, yeah.
Because anger is a really common response when we've been hurt, and often we feel justified in our anger.
Yeah.
We have a right to be angry for what happened to us. And that might be true. When we've been wronged, or when our kids are wronged, or our spouse is wronged, we have a right to be angry. What we need to ask ourselves is this: will prolonged anger, the anger that we often feed into over time and sometimes becomes consumed with, is this clutch we have on our anger really helpful? How is it working for us to live with unchecked anger?
Ooh, I've been there. It doesn't work well.
That's right.
Now, psychologist Nick Wignall says this: it's normal to feel anger toward your offender. There are good reasons for this that are related to the maintenance of social order and fairness. Feeling angry temporarily feels good because it boosts your ego. It makes us feel a little bit better about ourselves if we can vent anger towards our offender who is wrong. It makes us feel right.
Yeah, that's why I like anger so much sometimes.
That's why we all like it. Now, Nick goes on to say that in the long run, unchecked anger often leads to unhelpful amounts of mental elaboration over the wrong done to you, which actually keeps those memories strong and readily accessible in your mind. They take up too much room. He suggests that when you notice yourself feeling angry, pause briefly and acknowledge the anger, validating that you have every right to feel angry. But then ask yourself, will continuing to elaborate on what happened and extending my anger do me any good in the long run?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Just because your anger is justified doesn't mean it's helpful.
Wow.
So validate your anger, but don't feed it.
We're so excited to let you know about something brand new we've created just for you.
We've realized that with so many episodes available here on the show, it might feel a bit overwhelming to find the topics that matter most to you. That's why we've created a simple tool for you to receive a personalized playlist focused on your current struggle or your biggest challenge.
That's right. It's called the Blended Family Breakthrough Quiz. You'll answer just a few questions, and based on your responses, we'll email you a curated custom playlist of episodes that are specific to you.
This simple quiz will direct you to the most impactful episodes that pertain to you personally and keep you on track in your journey of discovery, learning, and growth. So, scroll all the way to the bottom of the show notes for this episode and click the link to take the Blended Family Breakthrough Quiz today.
Okay, let's get back to the discussion. That's a great thought for me.
Yeah.
Just because your anger is justified doesn't mean it's helpful.
Yeah, because it's not helpful. Nick says that forgiveness and anger don't mix well. And his key point is to realize that the less you mentally elaborate on your anger and what happened to you, the less frequently your mind will remind you of what happened. And this will help you to eventually reach a place of forgiveness.
That's good.
Yeah, so remember, when the anger hits, simply pause to validate your right to be angry, but then make a choice to avoid feeding into the anger or reliving the memory of those painful events. And that brings us to another facet of forgiveness: how to handle those painful memories so that you don't have to keep elaborating on your anger.
Right. Yeah. Because the truth is, you can't really control your memories necessarily, but you can control where you place your attention.
Yes.
That's another quote from Nick that we really appreciate. And we'll put a link in the show notes to his article called The Psychology of Forgiveness, 7 Lessons on How to Finally Let Go and Forgive Someone. It's a great article.
Really good.
Yeah. You know, it's not realistic to think that we can just forgive and forget. It's unlikely that your memories are going to magically disappear and that the pain that you've experienced won't come to mind ever again.
No.
But you get to choose what you're going to do with those difficult memories. You don't have to keep being drawn back into the pain. Now, we aren't saying that you shouldn't reflect on what happened, or process through the events or acknowledge the pain. This can actually be incredibly healing, especially when it's done with some help, like a coach or a qualified therapist. Mm-hmm. Even just journaling can be a really therapeutic response to process through what was going on with whatever happened.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I have a huge file of letters that I journaled to my ex where I really unloaded all my anger, all my frustrations, and my disbelief of what was happening. And I said all the nasty things I wanted to say to him and made all my judgments about his flawed character. It was really therapeutic.
I only read some of that, but you're right. Some of it was pretty harsh.
And, these were letters that I never intended to send to him. But just writing them helped me to move the painful events from my mind and onto the paper or onto the computer screen where I could release them and let them go. Because once I'd processed my hurts and expressed my strong opinions, I was then able to begin really releasing some of these things. The memory started to fade, and I didn't get drawn back into that pain.
Yeah, what a great example of one, just processing the anger like we talked about a few minutes ago, but not necessarily continuing to dwell on it. And then, processing through the painful event in a healthy way that kept you from having to keep mulling over and keep mulling over. And it gave you some mental boundaries, right? By just simply acknowledging those spontaneous memories when they came up and then choosing to refocus your attention somewhere else.
Absolutely.
Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "You can't keep a bird from landing on your head, but you can keep it from building a nest there." So you can shoo that bird away, that difficult, painful memory. You can shoo it away. You don't have to let it build its ugly nest and just sit on your head. You have full control of what you allow yourself to think about and dwell on.
Yeah, I think as I journaled stuff, I released it and then I didn't have to think about it anymore.
Right.
It's like, okay, I got it down on paper and now I can let it go.
Yep. And if it did come back up, you can just remind yourself, no, I already wrote that. I processed it. I'm going to choose to do something else.
I don't need to keep going back to it.
Yeah. Now, this might be really hard if you've been holding a grudge against someone for a long time. It'll probably be really challenging if that's the case for you. And sometimes pain becomes so ingrained in us and we've entertained these painful memories for so long that they kind of become part of us. And to forgive and let go feels like actually cutting away part of who we are. The bitterness and the fantasies of revenge, they kind of feel like old friends that we don't really want to lose, right? It's become almost a part of our identity. But in reality, it's toxic and it's unhealthy. And most of the time, it's robbing you of the joy and the happiness that you deserve to experience.
Absolutely.
So if this is you, be courageous and consistent as you practice the skill of redirecting your thoughts so that these old painful memories don't have to intrude on your future well-being. And you don't need to continue to suffer with this weight of this ugly nest that continues to get built on your head. I spent way too many years being held hostage by unforgiveness in my life. I've shared on the podcast previously that I grew up in really difficult blended family dynamics. My stepmom struggled with anger, and it regularly leaked out onto us kids in the form of verbal and physical abuse. And for a multitude of reasons, my dad just wasn't able to stand in the gap and protect us. And as a result, I left home at 16 years old and I just had to find my way in the world. Now, for years, I felt angry and abandoned and hurt and confused. In fact, I had virtually no contact with my dad and stepmom as I finished up school. I headed into the work world. I navigated a diagnosis of cancer and underwent a year of chemo and radiation in my mid-20s. I met Kim. I got married. All of that stuff happened over a 10-year period of time. And I think I only remember having about 3 points of interaction with my parents through that entire period.
Yeah, they didn't even come to our wedding.
No, they didn't know that I was even getting married. Yeah. I dealt with a tremendous amount of resentment and anger. And every time I recounted the story or I shared with people in my life about this mistreatment that I had experienced, I would engage my anger in a new way that was just a little deeper, and it held me emotionally hostage just a little while longer. It kept me from fully opening up to Kim. It kept me from fully engaging with my stepdaughter. I had a right to be angry. What happened to me was not fair. It wasn't right. But I was the one that was being held hostage, not my dad and my stepmom. They were moving along with life. They were enjoying their empty nest years. They were enjoying some grandkids from some of my other siblings. It was me who was stuck. I still remember the day when I told Kim, I think I'm going to write my parents a letter.
Yeah, I was shocked.
You were shocked, yeah. But I did. I actually took a couple months, probably, I don't know how many different versions I wrote, but I wrote a long letter expressing some of my memories in the most respectful way I could possibly do. And I let them know that I actually did want to connect with them, but I wasn't ready for a phone call or anything. I just gave them my address back in the days when we all used snail mail. And I wrote an actual handwritten letter and invited them to write back to me. Now, honestly, I never expected to hear from them, but just the act of respectfully expressing my experiences in that letter was a huge step in my forgiveness journey with them. To my surprise, they did write back. And that was almost 20 years ago. And slowly over that time, I've learned to intentionally choose to refocus my energy when the painful memories hit, because sometimes they still do hit. Rather than focusing on my anger from the past, I'm choosing to focus on the progress of today. I'm continually learning to accept my dad for who he is. I've stopped expecting him to meet my ideal of what I think he should be, which really leads us to the next thing that you need to consider as you take steps toward the forgiveness that you really need to experience.
Yeah, so we've talked about how anger and memories can get in the way of forgiveness and touched on possible ways to deal with that. And now let's talk about acceptance.
Yeah.
Often when someone has been hurt and they're struggling to move on, their well-meaning friends will say something like, you just have to accept what happened and let it go. But how exactly do we do that? And what does acceptance even mean? Acceptance can be especially hard if the offensive behavior is still happening.
Yeah, you're confronted with it regularly.
Yeah, that can be the case when it comes to stepchildren or an ex-spouse who we don't have a lot of control over.
Or actually each other as well.
Yes. And often we feel entitled to get an apology and expect them to make things right or do the right thing. We get stuck there. But the truth is, you can't change someone who doesn't take responsibility for their actions. You can only change how you respond to them. And this can be really hard because sometimes we believe that if we can just control the past or if we can control the behavior of others, that we'll feel more powerful ourselves and we'll be in control. But ultimately, this is an illusion. It leaves us feeling frustrated and dependent on others to change.
Yeah.
If instead we can choose to let go of that desire to control the past and how others behave, we actually discover the key to taking control over our own future. A conscious choice of acceptance does not mean that you approve of the other person's behavior or what they've done is okay.
Right.
Acceptance means acknowledging that you don't have power or control over the behavior of others or what's happened in the past. Now, this realization can really free you up to forgive by not allowing the behaviors of others, which is outside of your control, to impact your happiness and well-being. Now, this might mean that you need to set some healthy boundaries with someone that's caused you harm or is really toxic. Just because we forgive someone doesn't mean we have to trust them or that we're expected to reconcile with them.
Yeah, but setting healthy boundaries can be challenging if the offensive behavior is ongoing and you still have to interact with them or even live in the same house with them. So if you need some support with that, you might want to check out episode 27 called How to Set Clear Boundaries and Safeguard Relationships. And we talk a little bit about that because boundaries can be a tricky thing.
Yeah.
So you might want to go check that out. And one more thought on this, forgiveness is not about relieving the other person of responsibility or letting them off the hook. You can still hold someone accountable for their behavior, even if they don't take responsibility for it. Depending on the situation and only when it's appropriate, you can calmly and respectfully communicate and help that person to understand how their words and their actions have impacted you. But before you do this, you've got to do a motivation check.
Absolutely.
It has to come from the right place. If your motivation is just to try and get that apology you're looking for from them, or if you're expecting their behavior to suddenly change as a result of this conversation, you might need to wait until you've taken a few more steps toward a place of forgiveness before you actually communicate with them about that pain that they've caused.
Yeah, because you probably aren't going to get those things.
Yeah, you may not. A healthy motivation for this kind of communication is that you truly care about their growth as a person and the growth of your relationship in some way.
Yes.
You might start reaching a place where you believe they're mature enough to receive your input. However, the reality is they might get defensive and angry if they aren't in that place to hear what you've got to share. And that could add to your own pain if you end up feeling unheard or invalidated. So you need to be careful here. It's great if you can work with a therapist or a coach to kind of decide how you'll communicate with them.
Or even if you need to communicate
Yeah, exactly.
with them.
Yeah, there's cases where it's not always appropriate to actually communicate. But that doesn't mean you can't work toward forgiveness for them just because you can't communicate with them. You know, when I wrote that letter to my parents, my motivation was not to change them, nor did I even expect an apology. I knew there was a huge risk of either being ignored, or that they would rationalize what happened in the home when I was young, or even that they might attack back. But at that point, I knew it was worth the risk, and my motivation was simply to keep healing myself. And I knew that finding a way toward forgiveness for them was critical for me. It was my work, not theirs.
Yeah. And my experience with my ex, it's a bit different. I never have approached him with this kind of conversation because I know it wouldn't do any good.
Yeah.
He feels vindicated and superior in his behavior, and he really doesn't care that he's caused harm to anyone.
Sure.
So attempting to hold him accountable for what he's done would just backfire, and ultimately it would cause more pain for me.
Yeah.
So it's not safe.
No, and it's not a general thing of reaching back out to those who have wronged you. It's really a case-by-case scenario.
Exactly. So you need to be very careful. I shared that I worked with my counselor through this process of forgiving my ex. And part of that process was leaning into my faith and asking God to help me forgive. Because honestly, I couldn't do it without some help.
Sure.
And this was a significant turning point for me and very meaningful. Now, if you're a person of faith and you'd like to explore a biblical approach to forgiveness, we're going to link an article from Laura Petherbridge called Forgiveness: What It Is, What It Isn't.
Yeah.
Laura does a good job really exploring some of the distorted teaching on forgiveness in the faith community. And she also talks about healing from deep betrayal. It's a really good article.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you found that article from Laura, and she even talks about some of her own experiences as a stepmom. Who, you know, if you don't know who Laura Petherbridge is, she's another great speaker and author that talks a lot about blended family life, and you might want to go check it out. I'm also glad that you found this because you know what? Sometimes you talked about your faith, hon. Sometimes the faith community, you know, we just get this whole message around forgiveness wrong. Sometimes we hear these messages that forgiveness is just, you know, forgive and forget and act like nothing ever happened. Now we're just going to grin and bear it, right? Because we don't want to say anything bad about anybody. But I don't think that's right, nor do I think that's even a biblical perspective. And Laura does a good job of helping kind of sort through some of that.
Yeah.
My experience of forgiveness with multiple relationships in my life has been so rooted in my faith. And it's included intentional work on my part as well.
Right.
It's been some of what God wanted from me to engage just in the process, but a huge part of it was what he wants for me, which is freedom from that emotional baggage that I was carrying around. And that kind of brings us to one more thought. And it might be one of the hardest ones to wrap our minds around because it has to do with our feelings, our emotions. It might be difficult to understand that, yes, people do tend to feel better as a result of forgiveness, but we shouldn't expect any specific set of feelings or lack of feelings once we begin the process of forgiveness.
Yeah.
While we can control our actions or how we think or behave and respond, including that choice to forgive someone, we can't always control how we feel. And the reason why it's really important to talk about this is because forgiveness is a choice and it's a commitment. It's not a feeling.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're waiting around until you feel like forgiving someone that hurt you, you are really unlikely to ever get there.
Yeah. I didn't ever feel like forgiving my ex, if I'm honest. I didn't want to walk through that process, and it actually felt like it would have been easier just to stay stuck in unforgiveness and bitterness and pain. But even though something seems easy, it isn't always what's best. I knew that I needed to forgive, even though I didn't feel ready. I wasn't feeling it at all, honestly. But for those initial steps towards forgiving my ex, they were actually an act of obedience to God because I trusted him and I believe that he had my best interests at heart and wanted me to be healed of my hurts. And one thing I learned along the way was that I had to continually commit to the process of forgiveness because it's not a one and done thing.
That's right.
One decision to forgive is not enough. We must prepare ourselves to be ready to forgive over and over again, sometimes every day, sometimes every hour, depending on where we're at in the process. And while it does get easy with time and practice, it gets easier. Forgiveness is an ongoing process. It's an attitude and a habit that we choose every time we feel that familiar pain bubbling up again. Those difficult feelings that we don't always have control over. And when those feelings hit, we need to commit once again to forgive, even if we don't feel like it. Now, if you're facing ongoing pain with someone that you have to continually be around, this will be something you'll need to get really good at. Recognizing that you don't feel like forgiving their latest offense, but choosing and committing to doing it anyway for your benefit, as well as the preservation of that relationship. You know, my daughter is an adult now, and I really haven't had to interact with my ex for a long time.
That's right.
And I still sometimes need to go through the forgiveness process, especially after talking about that painful season that we had of parental alienation. In fact, not too long ago, we recorded a podcast episode about that, episode 42, our challenging story of parental alienation. And I've also written a blog article about it as well. And just doing those things triggered a lot of pain, and it stirred up anger towards my ex all over again. And guess what? I had to forgive him again. I've gone through this process many, many, many times, but it's so much better than being overcome with negative, painful memories and getting stuck in that toxic place of unforgiveness.
Yeah, it's so challenging. And when we choose not to move forward, when we choose to just sit in unforgiveness, it can really be disastrous. I have a pretty strong sense that my stepmom was stuck in a place of unforgiveness because of some of the things that I've heard about her childhood that was just true for her. And I think that that was the root of a lot of the anger that came out on us as a family.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah. And because of what I experienced, that cycle got perpetuated in me early on in our marriage. And I had to reach a place of recognizing that if I really wanted to stop responding to my frustration and anger within our family in a way that was going to be productive, that I had to go back into the realm of forgiveness and figure out how I wasn't going to allow that stuckness of my stepmom to impact me anymore.
Yeah.
And so if you're fighting against forgiveness, if you're wanting to hold on to that bitterness and that anger, I get it. I've been there. In fact, it took me quite a while to figure out a way out. But I assure you that if you can do that, you're going to be changing the face of the future for everyone in your family.
Yeah, you're breaking
your
cycles.
Your kids, your stepkids are going to experience a healthier you, and that's going to create a healthier them as they continue to move forward.
Yeah, it's really sad when people go to the grave holding on to bitterness and anger from something that happened
Absolutely.
years and years
Yeah.
before, but you hear about that happening and it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that. I don't know if I've ever shared on the podcast that my stepmom actually has since passed away about 12 years ago, I think. And I think she finally, later on in life, I think she actually did reach a better place of forgiveness.
I hope so.
Yeah, I think that was true for her. And I hope that as well.
I do know that your experience of forgiving her made a huge impact in you.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I still work through some of that because I still have interaction with Dad. And I want to have that interaction with him. But I still have to work through forgiveness with him in the moment, which is what you were talking about just a little bit ago, because he's not necessarily responding to me exactly the way I'd really like in a dad, right?
That's tough.
But because I'm not allowing unforgiveness to hold me hostage any longer, I'm also no longer holding him hostage to be someone he just isn't. Sometimes when we need to work through forgiveness for someone who's still in our lives, we've got to lean into that acceptance piece that we talked about earlier and start focusing more on our progress and what's going reasonably right, as opposed to being consumed with those things that we're still frustrated with. And in the end, that's our choice.
Absolutely.
No one else is going to make that choice for us.
Yeah.
So, forgiveness is a big and complex topic. It isn't easy. We're not going to solve every bit of it in, a 40-minute podcast or whatever this turns out to be. But we believe it's absolutely necessary if you don't want to be robbed of relational connections in your home, and if you want to be restored to a place of peace and happiness. And we really all deserve that.
We do.
You've got to figure out how you're going to forgive the hurts and the hangups that you've experienced.
And be willing.
Mm-hmm. So let's just recap a little bit of the action steps that we've talked about. First, we've got to validate that anger that we feel when a wrong hits us, but we don't want to feed it. Remember that anger and forgiveness don't really mix very well.
No. Next, we're going to set and enforce healthy mental boundaries around our painful memories by acknowledging them, but not allowing them to build a nest and take over.
That's right. Then we can move to a place of acceptance by acknowledging that we don't have the power or the control over the behavior of others or over what's happened in the past.
And don't forget that we must move beyond our feelings, because forgiveness is a choice and a commitment, not a feeling.
That's right.
And one more quick thought around forgiveness. Even if you've been hurt, it can be helpful and revealing if you can try putting yourself in the other person's shoes, especially if the person that's hurt you is your spouse or your stepchild. Remember that everyone's perspective in a blended family is different, and sometimes we inadvertently or accidentally say or do things that will hurt each other.
Yeah.
And also realize that at some point, you'll also need to be forgiven, because no one handles these dynamics perfectly. We all make mistakes,
That's
and at
right.
some point, you're going to need their forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, an ancient proverb says this: "A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his own opinion." I love that. Be willing to listen and understand where the other person might be coming from, and avoid getting stuck in the blind spot of your own opinions.
Yeah.
Open yourself up to clearly see the perspective of others, and without excusing poor behavior, seek to understand what's underneath their behavior, maybe their fears, their motivations, their hurts, and then really try to clarify any misunderstandings between you. There can be a lot of misunderstandings in blended family life.
Yeah, there are a lot of
Yeah.
misunderstandings.
Yeah. Gaining insight and understanding is always beneficial, especially in step-family dynamics. And now, if you're struggling to forgive someone in the other home, maybe the ex-spouse or the other step-parent over there, we encourage you to seek understanding there as well, because that's going to help you to put things into a broader perspective and move towards forgiveness, so that you can build a more cooperative relationship with them and enjoy more peace, right? We all want that.
That's right.
And again, this isn't easy. So if you need some support with this type of understanding, we've got several episodes that'll shed some light and help you gain more understanding. And we're going to link those to you in the show notes if you'd like to discover more insight with your stepkids as well as those living in the other home.
That's right. And, we've talked a few times about what it might look like to get help. We got help with counseling and other people along the way, mentors and such. And I just want to remind you, anytime we recommend people reaching out for help, make sure you're reaching out to someone who understands blended family dynamics. Maybe it's been a part of their training or at least a good part of their experience, because blended family dynamics are just simply different than first family dynamics. So make sure if you're reaching out for some help, that you take that into consideration.
Yeah. And that goes for support groups and online communities as well. Some of them can really feed the anger and the bitterness.
Right.
If you're feeling more and more revved up and fueled with your anger when you're engaging in these groups, it's not the right group to be
for
engaging in. Please. You want to find a group that's supportive and acknowledges what you've been through, but also helps you to move beyond it and not stay stuck.
Yeah. Beware social media to be processing this stuff. Yeah, that's right. All right. Well, that's what we have on forgiveness. If you have more questions or you want to talk further, you can always go to mikeandkimcoaching.com/share. And we would love to hear from you. You can just share a response to this particular episode. You can share with us some suggestions on what you'd like to hear in the future on the podcast, or you can just ask if we can connect, and we would love to hear from you and see what we might be able to do to support you. So that's going to take our episode to a close, but we will, of course, be back next week where we're going to talk about, well, what is it like if you want to go get help, but your partner isn't quite ready to do the same?
Yeah.
How can you actually start to talk to your partner about that and approach them in a way that invites them in and doesn't create more conflict?
Yeah.
So we're going to jump into that next week, but for now, that makes this episode a wrap.
Until next time.